Well, this is a medieval fantasy channel, I guess. A little history would be in order here. I played Blade of Darkness's little demo that came with a local video game magazine many years ago, and I loved it to bits. It had decent combat, but the real-time dynamic shadows stood out and gave me a lasting impression. 2001, this was cutting-edge stuff, and I kept replaying it to fool around with its torches just to see this tech in action. Afterwards, it's as if my memory of the experience went into a black hole, only to be awakened once the buzz for its Steam re-release was in full swing, and then I forgot about it again. Finally, a comment on my last video reminded me of its existence, so I thought it was an excellent opportunity to make a video about it before this happens to me again. I tend to be good at remembering stuff like this, but Blade of Darkness eluded me for years on end. In my defense, this is the most generic name you could think of for a game. I mean, come on. To its credit, the original release also had the edgy Severance in its title, which fits rather nicely with this humongous kebab sword on its poster. Between the name and the artwork, it's dangerously close to Sonic fan art, fucking hell. Blade of Darkness is a third-person action game, as you might have already guessed. This one doesn't have the unique combat mechanics of Die by the Sword, but it's got a sort of similar fantasy setting. It trades the damsel in distress cliché for the sacred sword that destroys all evil trope. Overall, the plot is mundane. Mysterious evil force starts attacking with armies of orcs and undead, and that sword is the key to banishing the enemy. Even so, there's an honest effort of world building. Each level you visit comes bundled with some narration describing history of the place, and there are plenty of opportunities to read ancient inscriptions containing prophecies and the like. Now, don't get me wrong, all of it is so generic that you'll be hard pressed to remember it a couple of weeks after playing through the game, but you have to give them props for fleshing out what they have. It helps a lot actually, because the levels themselves aren't something to talk about in terms of design. It's the reason why I avoid going through it level by level like I sometimes do. Unfortunately, it's just not much to talk about that's very interesting. You follow a path, kill enemies along the way, push switches, collect keys, do a little backtracking, and that's basically it. But because of the backstory and their look, they are more intriguing and have their own personality. There's a diverse cast of locations such as Knight's Fort, a desert oasis, a mountain fortress, Mordor, and so on. They're usually straightforward, but there are a few instances where you're supposed to do some not so intuitive things to proceed, such as jumping in this bottomless pit after being shown that falling from height is a bad idea in general. They also include puzzles that aren't overly complex. I think the chore of backtracking for some of them is more significant of a challenge, since it sometimes involves platforming, which is certainly not the game's forte. One of the strange things in my opinion is how it handles the designs for playthroughs with different characters. You see, at the start of the game you get to choose between 4 classes: a knight, a barbarian, a dwarf, and an amazon. Each has its own class of weapons and armor you get to pick up, and a unique introductory level, but the special weapons are useless for different classes, so I really don't see why you can still find and pick them up. It would have been better to have the game spawn only your own classes and neutral weapons, because this is just clutter. The game looks reasonably competent on a technical level for something initially released in 2001. Of course, the show's biggest stars are the lighting and shadows, and it doesn't shy away from showing off what it can do with them. I like that sometimes shadows are cast on the wall for dramatic effect. Scenes like this are really neat to see. Picking up a torch and running around casts shadows all over the place in a rather convincing manner. It's just a shame that there's only one section where they are really needed. Most of the time, what's already lit up on the walls and ceilings is good enough. This crypt where you have to go around and light up the torches on the walls is a really cool section, and it's a shame there's no more like it. On the audio side though, it's more like a mixed bag. The good part is that the narrator's voice is actually good and makes the world building aspect more interesting to listen to. But man oh man, the sound mixing is so goddamn strange. For one thing, the stuff he says at the end of the levels can be barely heard because the music is blaring so loud, despite being set at the same level in the options menu.
Cazel's alarm has fallen. All the cities of the dwarves will be on their guard. Their gates will be barred. Woe betide those like you who remain on the outside.
Which is at half of its maximum because my ears were hurting after a couple of seconds of listening to this. I've never played a game with its default audio settings so high. The volume of sounds or music randomly picks up and down with sometimes hilarious results. I'll show you this scene just so it's clear what I'm talking about. Beware of those using headphones, you have been warned. Jesus Christ, this is a deep-fried meme 20 years before its time. Considering that this is a re-release, it's even stranger still. You'd expect these technical issues to be ironed out after all. I usually don't talk about music, but here there's a huge enigma to me that I can't let it slide. On one hand, the game has a composer listed in its credits, but everything seems thrown together. When the game wants you spooked, it starts obviously spooky music that's as subtle as a borax, and it tries to pull this trick so damn often. The same goes for its attempted jump scares, if you can call them that, where it uses a small composition that sounds very familiar. I don't know about you, but I can almost swear I've heard it in an Aliens film or in one of my AVP playthroughs. But the strangeness doesn't even begin here, because you can listen to this composition when you start a new game. Those more perceptive might recognize it from Max Payne 2's scene with Monarch Sax.
If you think nothing can get to you, you're lying to yourself.
This leaves me completely stumped because Blade of Darkness came 2 years before Max Payne 2. Now I know better than to simply jump at the conclusion that someone plagiarized the music of another composer, especially since for one I'm not a musician, but that rhythmic violin in the background sounds too similar and it has an identical tempo. Was it taken from an asset library and used with different accompanying instruments in each song? Was it actually copied by one of the Finnish composers who made the soundtrack for Max Payne 2? In all honesty, if the roles were reversed, I wouldn't even have batted an eye, just chalking it off as an example of a small production taking inspiration from a prominent game, and that'd be that for me. Out of all things that I expected to encounter while playing this game, this musical mystery was definitely not on the list. Now we reach the gameplay, and damn, this did not age well. The game has a vocal fanbase from what I've witnessed, so now I'm in a very awkward position. So there goes nothing. I initially got scared when I noticed that you can't strafe here either after the nightmares I've had with Die by the Sword, but I quickly calmed down after realizing that mouse look is here at least. I mean, until I saw how the mouse works in this game. It has a very high sensitivity on the horizontal axis and very little on vertical, making the mouse control that is difficult to get used to. When the re-release's developers put in widescreen resolutions, I suspect that they didn't adjust the mouse controls to match it, because it's behaving as if I'm playing on a 4x3 like in the good old days. While in melee combat this is annoying, and during platforming it's going to lead you to the load game screen often, but when it comes to using a bow and arrow it's simply atrocious. I personally refuse to use it as much as possible because of just how terrible it is to control. Additionally, the way aiming seeing works is frankly baffling. You aim to the left of your screen to such an exaggerated degree that even without the mouse issues it would have been a bad experience, but when you realize that the true ending of the campaign requires acquiring some runes hidden behind puzzles accessible only with the bow, it's very easy to see why I was not thrilled by this discovery. The general combat involves a bit of strategy, all things considered. You can't just rush opponents and mash buttons because striking their shield stun locks you and give your opponents an opening. It's pretty meaty and killing enemies is fairly spectacular, with blood and limbs flying as you emerge victoriously. That being said, don't expect some super in-depth combat loops because this isn't really the case. You have combos accessible for each weapon, but I have to say this is the start of the issues with controls overall. I know that I am not a super dexterous guy, but I feel that even simple combos are difficult to trigger because of the tiny room of error. I have a suspicion it's a problem with the controls themselves though, because even regular attacks seem to not be super responsive, and it doesn't feel really tight either. The worst is when you attempt a combo involving pressing the forward and backward keys simultaneously, because it's also the combination for a quick 180 turn with your character. Now imagine how fun it is to turn your back on your opponent because the game just doesn't register that you press those buttons as part of a different combo. But it gets even worse. For one, the game really loves locking you into animations. For instance, if you want to drink a healing potion in combat, you get stuck into this long animation or this shorter but still too long variant when you use the target lock. It's super annoying and it adds to the clunky impression. The camera is also terrible since for some reason it tends to interfere with your ability to run in a straight line. This is beyond the classical issues of getting it stuck to walls. Fortunately, the game includes a targeting lock system that helps quite a bit, but it still has problems. For one, it's still not very precise and you can easily miss your opponents because your camera is not centered on them. If you fight multiple opponents at once, it doesn't automatically lock on someone else after killing your initial target, which leads to more frustration in the heat of battle. The worst is when you fight these super duper vampires that can teleport behind you for some nothing personnel kid action. I say this because it disables the targeting whenever they spawn behind you. Even if you have good reactions, you can still get screwed because the controls are still janky and don't always respond to your inputs. But the absolute worst part of the combat is the interaction between your enemy's hitboxes and the arc of your weapon swings. In short, it's all over the place. It's not just frustrating, but frankly infuriating down the line. Does your opponent stay on a small step higher than your character? You'll miss him entirely while he beats the shit out of you. Face an enemy with a slightly larger size than usual? Well, enjoy missing all your swings because their hitbox is crap and nothing connects unless you are in a perfect position, which gets you killed more often than not. Initially, this problem was not very obvious. In fact, combat was pretty enjoyable and responsive, but the more you advance, the more it's exacerbated by the increasingly big opponents with weird hitboxes, and it results in ruining the fun you had up until that point. It's not fun to lose a bunch of stamina on a special combo attack that completely misses despite being close enough. Doubly so when you get exhausted and the game promptly locks you into a 5-second animation that you can't skip. When you start facing more and more rooms full of enemies that you can't adequately hit, it makes you want to stop playing, which I did. Now don't get me wrong, for 2001 this was solid gameplay, no question about that. It's only that in 2022 I have a hard time moving past its archaic annoyances. Who knows, had I played the complete game over and over back when it launched, I might have had a bit of nostalgia to give me a little more patience. But in this situation, I'm on the fence when it comes to recommending its purchase at its listed $13 price. Despite the flaws, it's not a bad game. The combat is reasonably competent while it lasts. It's challenging, it has a good amount of exploration and secrets, and is going to keep you occupied for at least 8 to 10 hours in a world that, while generic, isn't downright boring. Thanks to everyone for being here while I ruin old nostalgic memories. Click the buttons that bring in the good times and share this video with like-minded fellows. And until next time, cheers!